Chapter 1. The Forbidden Touch. Kale never expected to be thrown into a world of danger and lust the moment his fingers brushed against the Fae Lord, Erevan. The curse that had kept Erevan away from mortal affection for centuries had now been shattered. And Kale, an Omega, found himself the unwilling object of Erevan's dark desire. But Erevan's curse didn't just make him untouchable, it threatened to destroy them both. "You shouldn't be here," Erevan growled, his grip tightening around Kale's wrist. Kale's heart raced as Erevan's fiery eyes bore into him, full of unspoken torment. "You're playing with fire, Omega." Kale's pulse quickened. He had never imagined that a single touch could ignite something so dangerous, so intoxicating. But as Erevan pulled him closer, their bodies nearly touching, Kale knew there was no turning back. The moment they connected, Kale became an unwilling participant in the Fae Lord's curse, and Erevan's dark hunger would only grow stronger. "You'll regret this," Erevan murmured, his voice low and filled with a mix of rage and lust. But Kale couldn't help the way his body reacted, the way his own desire matched Erevan's intensity. He knew it was forbidden, knew the risk, but as Erevan's lips hovered near his ear, Kale could feel the pull, an undeniable connection that neither of them could ignore. In that moment, Kale made a choice. He wasn't sure if it was the right one, but he had already stepped too far into the Fae world. And now, there was no turning back. Chapter 2. Unwelcome in their world. Kale was now a prisoner in Erevan's manor, hidden deep within the Faelands, a realm where mortals were not welcome. He had been whisked away, taken from the world he knew, and thrust into this strange, dangerous place. The air was thick with magic, and everything here seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Erevan, still the Fae Lord who controlled the land with an iron fist, was not pleased with Kale's presence. Despite the growing attraction between them, Erevan made it clear that Kale was an inconvenience. "You don't belong here," he snapped as Kale stood in the lavish hallway, staring out of the enormous window that looked out over the Faelands. "I didn't ask to be here," Kale retorted, not backing down. His heart was heavy with confusion, torn between the desire that pulsed between them and the reality of Erevan's curse. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be here. That somehow, his fate was tied to Erevan's. "Then leave," Erevan commanded, his voice cold, but Kale could see the flicker of pain in his eyes. "You have no place in my world." Yet, every time Kale tried to step back, to break free from the pull that drew them together, Erevan seemed to stop him. A heavy silence fell between them. Kale was determined to survive this place, to somehow find a way out of the mess he had created by touching Erevan. But deep inside, he felt the connection between them, undeniable and impossible to ignore. Chapter 3. The Dark Desires. The longer Kale stayed at Erevan's manor, the stronger the pull between them became. It wasn't just attraction, it was a force, dark and unrelenting, that surged whenever they were close. Erevan fought it, but Kale could see the strain in his eyes. The curse he bore was a constant battle, and Kale was now an unwilling participant in that struggle. "You make it worse," Erevan snarled one night, his breath hot against Kale's skin as he pushed him against the wall. Kale gasped, heart racing, but he couldn't help the way his body responded to Erevan's closeness. "You make me want things I can't have. Things that will destroy both of us." Kale struggled to breathe, the tension in the air suffocating. "Then why don't you stay away from me?" he shot back, his voice trembling. "You're the one who keeps pulling me in." Erevan's eyes flickered with anger and something else, something far darker. "I don't have a choice anymore. The curse is stronger than either of us. And now that you've touched me, it's only a matter of time before it consumes us both." Despite the danger, despite the warning in Erevan's words, Kale felt a sense of powerlessness. The draw between them was so strong that it made his heart ache with longing. He couldn't help but wonder if it was fate, or if it was a curse meant to destroy them both. "Stay away," Erevan growled, but Kale could feel the lie in his voice. Neither of them could stay away from the other for long. Chapter 4. Forbidden Love. The pull between Kale and Erevan grew stronger with each passing day. Kale tried to resist, but it was useless. Erevan's touch, his scent, his very presence had become an addiction Kale couldn't shake. He would have given anything to make sense of what was happening to him, but the truth was simple. He had fallen for the Fae Lord in a way that was dangerous, forbidden. One night, after a heated argument, Cale found himself alone in a garden outside the manor. The night air was cool, but his skin burned from the touch of Erevan's angry words. He felt trapped, torn between his growing feelings for Erevan and the reality that their relationship was doomed. "You're playing with fire, Cale," Erevan's voice broke through the silence, and Cale turned to see him standing there, his figure silhouetted against the moonlight. "Do you think this will end well?" Cale swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I can't stop this. I can't stop wanting you." Erevan's eyes flickered with something dangerous, something he tried to hide. "Then you've sealed your fate," he said softly. And in that moment, Cale knew that despite everything, despite the curse, despite the danger, it was too late for them both. Chapter 5. The Fragile Truths. Cale's confinement stretched into days, and while Erevan gave him space, the air between them remained heavy with unspoken tension. As Cale explored the manor, he uncovered fragments of Erevan's past, paintings of a once thriving family, books filled with cryptic runes, and a locked chamber emanating dark energy. Curiosity gnawed at Cale, but Erevan's sharp warnings to stay out of certain areas kept him cautious. One evening, Cale confronted Erevan in the library, holding up a book he'd found detailing the Fae Lord's curse. "This is about you, isn't it?" he asked, his voice steady despite his hammering heart. Erevan's expression darkened, and he snatched the book from Cale's hands. "Stay out of things you don't understand," Erevan growled, his shadows writhing in agitation. Cale refused to back down. "You think isolating yourself will solve anything? You're just hiding from your pain." His words struck a nerve, and Erevan's grip on the book faltered. For a fleeting moment, Cale thought he saw a crack in the Alpha's stoic mask, but Erevan quickly shut down. "You don't know anything about me," he said coldly before storming out. Alone in the dim library, Cale's frustration bubbled over. He didn't understand why Erevan's struggles mattered to him, but they did. Despite his defiance, a part of him wanted to unravel the mystery of the cursed Alpha and his pain, a dangerous curiosity he couldn't ignore. Chapter 6. The Shared Burden. The next morning, Cale awoke to find Erevan waiting for him with a guarded expression. "We need to talk," the Alpha said, his tone devoid of its usual venom. Reluctantly, Cale followed him to the gardens, where the air was heavy with the scent of blooming flowers. Erevan's posture was stiff as he began to speak. "The curse. It's killing me." Cale blinked, taken aback by the sudden confession. "What do you mean, killing you?" he asked cautiously. Erevan's gaze was distant as he explained. "Every time someone dies by my touch, the curse feeds on my life force. It's why I've isolated myself." His voice wavered slightly, and Cale felt a pang of sympathy despite himself. For the first time, Cale saw Erevan as more than a ruthless Alpha. He was a man burdened by a curse he never asked for. "Why are you telling me this?" Cale asked, his tone softer now. Erevan hesitated before replying. "Because you're the first person who's ever survived my touch. Maybe you're the key to breaking it." The weight of Erevan's words settled over Cale, and for the first time, he saw the vulnerability hidden beneath the Alpha's hardened exterior. Though he didn't fully trust Erevan, Cale felt a flicker of determination to uncover the truth about the curse, and to help the man who had become an unexpected enigma in his life. Chapter 7. The First Spark. Days passed, and Cale and Erevan found themselves forced into an uneasy truce. Erevan shared more about his curse, and Cale listened with a mix of fascination and empathy. Despite their bickering, a strange bond began to form between them, though neither dared to acknowledge it. One night, as they sat by the fire in the grand hall, Cale noticed Erevan's tired eyes and tense shoulders. Without thinking, he placed a hand on the Alpha's arm. "You're not alone in this," he said softly. Erevan froze at the touch but didn't pull away. "I've been alone for decades," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet despair. Cale's heart ached at the vulnerability in Erevan's voice. "You don't have to be," he said firmly. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Cale saw the flicker of something unspoken in Erevan's eyes, something that made his heart race. The firelight danced between them, illuminating the tension neither could deny. But before the moment could deepen, Erevan stood abruptly, his walls snapping back into place. "You should rest," he said curtly, leaving Cale alone by the fire. Cale watched him go, confusion and longing swirling in his chest. For all his determination to resist Erevan, Kael couldn't ignore the spark growing between them. Chapter 8. The Council's Threat. Their fragile peace was shattered when Erevan's council summoned him again, this time with grim news. A neighboring Fae Lord, Lord Theron, had learned of Kael's presence and demanded his execution. A mortal defying the curse threatens the balance, one council member argued. If word spreads, it could incite chaos. Erevan's expression darkened. Kael is under my protection, he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. But the council was relentless, warning him of the consequences of defying their authority. If you refuse to act, we will, they declared, leaving Erevan seething with anger. Kael, who had been eavesdropping from a hidden alcove, felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't realized the extent of the danger he was in. When Erevan found him later, Kael confronted him. You can't keep fighting for me, he said, his voice laced with guilt. It's putting you at risk. Erevan's jaw tightened, and his shadows coiled protectively around Kael. I won't let them harm you, he said fiercely. For the first time, Kael saw just how far Erevan was willing to go to protect him, and it terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Chapter 9. A Dangerous Alliance. Erevan, determined to keep Kael safe, sought out an unlikely ally, an exiled Fae seer named Silas, known for his ability to unravel curses. Silas lived in the shadowy depths of the Faelands, far from the reach of the council. The journey was treacherous, but Erevan was relentless, dragging Kael along despite his protests. Silas was nothing like Kael imagined. The seer was a gaunt figure with piercing silver eyes that seemed to see through his very soul. You bring a human into my domain? Silas asked, his tone mocking yet curious. Erevan's tone was sharp. He survived my touch. He might be the key. Silas inspected Kael with an unnerving intensity. The bond between you two. It's fragile but potent. However, breaking this curse will require sacrifices. Painful ones. His cryptic words unsettled Kael, but Erevan pressed for answers. What kind of sacrifice? He demanded. Silas only smirked. That's for fate to decide. As they left Silas's lair, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that they were plunging deeper into danger. Yet, he couldn't ignore the way Erevan's presence steadied him, even amidst the chaos. For all their differences, they were bound together now, by the curse and something far more dangerous, a growing connection. Chapter 10. A Moment of Weakness. Back at the manor, Kael's mind raced with Silas's cryptic warning. He found himself pacing the halls late at night until Erevan appeared, his expression as weary as Kael's. You should rest, Erevan said gruffly, though his voice lacked its usual bite. I can't stop thinking about what Silas said, Kael admitted. What if I'm the one who has to sacrifice something? Erevan's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer. I won't let that happen, he said firmly, his shadows curling protectively around them both. Their proximity made Kael's breath hitch. Why do you care so much? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Erevan hesitated, his usual walls crumbling. Because I've lost too much already. I can't lose you too. The vulnerability in his voice sent Kael's heart racing. Before he could think, Kael leaned in, brushing his lips against Erevan's. The kiss was brief but charged with emotion. When they pulled apart, both men were breathless. This is dangerous, Erevan murmured, but he didn't step away. Kael's resolve hardened. So is everything else about us. Chapter 11. The Council Strikes. The next morning, their fragile peace was shattered. A group of council enforcers stormed the manor, demanding Kael be handed over. You defy the laws of the Faelands, their leader growled at Erevan. Your actions threaten us all. Erevan stood his ground, his shadows rising like a storm. Kael is under my protection, he said, his voice icy. The tension in the room was palpable as the enforcers prepared to attack. Kael, terrified but resolute, stepped forward. If you want me, you'll have to go through him, he said boldly. The enforcers hesitated, and Erevan seized the moment, unleashing a surge of shadow magic that drove them back. The fight was brutal, and while Erevan emerged victorious, the toll it took on him was clear. His breaths were labored, his movements slower. As Kale helped him back inside, guilt gnawed at him. "This is all my fault," he muttered. Erevan shook his head, his gaze steady despite his exhaustion. "No, Kale. You're the reason I'm still fighting." The words left Kale speechless, a mix of fear and hope swirling in his chest. Chapter 12. The Revelation. Erevan's injuries from the battle forced him to rest, and for the first time, Kale took charge of the manor. As he tended to Erevan, he noticed a strange mark on the Alpha's chest, an intricate sigil that pulsed faintly with dark energy. "What is that?" Kale asked, his fingers brushing against it. Erevan flinched but didn't pull away. "It's the mark of the curse," he admitted. "Every time someone dies because of me, it grows stronger." Kale's heart ached at the weight Erevan carried. "There has to be a way to stop it," he said fiercely. Erevan's expression softened, and he placed a hand over Kale's. "You give me hope, Kale, but this curse, it's not just mine to bear. It's tied to the Faelands themselves." His words sent a chill down Kale's spine, but he refused to back down. As they sat together in the dim light, Kale realized just how far he was willing to go for Erevan. The Alpha's strength and vulnerability had become inseparable in Kale's eyes, and though the path ahead was fraught with danger, he knew he couldn't turn away now. Chapter 13. The Breaking Point. As Erevan's curse worsened, Kale found himself caught between duty and fear. Each day, Erevan's strength seemed to diminish, and the shadows around him grew darker. Kale's own powers, which he hadn't even known he possessed, began to stir. The more time he spent with Erevan, the more he felt an undeniable connection to him, something primal and ancient. One evening, as they walked through the manor's garden, Kale felt the weight of the situation more than ever. "I can't stand watching you deteriorate," he confessed, his voice shaking. Erevan, his face pale and drawn, stopped and turned to face him. "There's nothing we can do. I'm a curse, Kale. I always have been." Kale shook his head, refusing to accept that. "I don't care about your curse. I care about you." The words left him before he could stop them, and a sharp silence followed. Erevan's expression darkened, his gaze growing conflicted. "You don't know what you're saying," he murmured. But Kale, tired of holding back, stepped forward and kissed him, a kiss full of desperation, desire, and the hope that somehow they could break free from the chains of the curse. For a moment, everything else ceased to exist. When they finally broke apart, Kale knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 14. The Offer. The following days were fraught with tension, as Kale struggled with his growing feelings for Erevan. Yet, the Alpha seemed distant, as if the weight of their actions was beginning to crush him. Kale could feel the change, could see it in Erevan's eyes. He was pulling away, convinced that their connection was a threat to both their lives. One evening, Silas reappeared, offering a solution. "I found a way to break the curse," he said, his tone grave. "But it comes with a heavy price." Erevan's expression darkened, and he stood, towering over Silas. "What's the price?" he demanded. Silas's eyes flickered to Kale. "It will require the two of you to bond completely. No barriers between you. The curse will either be destroyed or fully transferred to Kale." Erevan's breath hitched. "No," he growled, stepping forward. "I won't let Kale suffer for this." Kale, despite the fear gnawing at him, stepped closer. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "You don't have to do this alone." The resolve in his voice caught Erevan off guard. The Alpha's eyes softened, but his heart remained torn. Kale was offering his life to save Erevan, and that kind of sacrifice changed everything. Chapter 15. The First Test. The ritual to begin the bond was excruciating, each step a test of their will and endurance. Kale and Erevan stood together in the center of an ancient circle, surrounded by the whispered chants of Silas. The air crackled with energy as they were forced to face each other's deepest fears and desires. Erevan's grip on Kale was tight, as if afraid that the bond would break them both. "This is wrong," he muttered, his voice strained. Kale shook his head, his heart pounding. "It's the only way, Erevan." With those words, the ritual began in full force. The pain was overwhelming. Kale felt as if his very soul was being pulled apart and reforged, and Erevan's tortured cries echoed in the distance. For a moment, Kael feared he would lose himself, but he held onto Erevan's hand, grounding himself in the Alpha's presence. The bond between them surged, both painful and exhilarating. When the ritual ended, both men collapsed, exhausted and battered. The air around them felt different, charged with something new, but the curse had not been broken. Instead, Kael felt something inside him change. His very being was now tethered to Erevan, for better or worse. Chapter 16. Unforeseen Consequences. The bond, while powerful, brought unforeseen consequences. Kael found himself overwhelmed by Erevan's emotions, each surge of pain and fear flowing through him like a storm. The intensity was nearly unbearable, and he began to question whether he had made the right choice. Erevan, too, struggled with the bond. He could feel Kael's every thought, every hesitation, and it was maddening. "I didn't want this for you," he confessed one night, his voice raw with guilt. "You've given up everything for me." Kael met his gaze, determination in his eyes. "I didn't give up anything. I chose this." Despite the pain and confusion, Kael knew he wouldn't back down. Their bond had irrevocably changed both of them, and now they had to navigate this new reality together. But there was no time for contemplation. The council, sensing the shift in power, began to stir again, sending threats and assassins to test Erevan's resolve. The battle for Kael's life was far from over. Erevan had only just begun to understand the cost of what he'd allowed, and Kael was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. Chapter 17. The Dark Path Ahead. The pressure from the council escalated, and with each passing day, the weight of Erevan's curse grew heavier. Erevan's once unshakable resolve was beginning to crack, and Kael could feel the Alpha's despair seeping through their bond. It terrified him, and yet he refused to back down. One night, after another failed assassination attempt, Kael found Erevan alone in the darkened study, his head in his hands. "I can't keep doing this," Erevan muttered. "I'm only dragging you deeper into my hell." Kael stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not dragging me anywhere. I'm here because I choose to be." The raw emotion in Kael's words stilled Erevan's shaking form. For the first time in days, the Alpha looked up, his eyes filled with something softer than the usual resolve. "I never wanted to be weak," Erevan confessed. "But I can't fight this anymore." Kael knelt before him, taking his hands. "You're not weak, Erevan. We're in this together. We'll find a way to break this, together." The Alpha's eyes flickered with something close to hope, but the path ahead was uncertain. Kael's words may have soothed Erevan for a moment, but the shadow of the curse loomed large, threatening to consume them both. Chapter 18. The Threatening Forces. As the bond between Kael and Erevan deepened, so did the danger surrounding them. The council, sensing their growing connection, began to increase their pressure. Agents sent by rival factions stalked the manor, searching for any sign of weakness in Erevan's defenses. Kael could feel the tension in the air, a constant undercurrent of threat that gnawed at his mind. Late one evening, the manor was rocked by an explosion that sent the entire household into chaos. Erevan barely managed to shield Kael from the blast, but the damage was done. The manor, once a place of solace, now seemed like a battlefield. Kael's pulse raced as Erevan stood protectively in front of him, his face grim. "They're getting bolder," Erevan muttered, eyes narrowing. "They want to see me fall." Despite the overwhelming danger, Kael refused to retreat. "We're not backing down," he declared, his voice steady despite the turmoil surrounding them. Erevan's gaze softened for a moment, but he didn't reply. Kael could see the exhaustion weighing on him. The constant battles, the curse, and their bond were pushing Erevan to his limits. "Whatever it takes, we'll face it together," Kael continued. "We've come this far." Erevan finally met his gaze, and for a brief moment, they shared a silent understanding. Kael was no longer just an ally, he was everything. Yet, even as their bond grew stronger, the darkness that threatened to destroy them loomed ever closer. Chapter 19. The Deteriorating Curse. Erevan's curse continued to take its toll. Every day, his body grew weaker, and his once indomitable spirit seemed to fade with each passing hour. Kael could feel the pain coursing through their bond, and it broke his heart to see Erevan so fragile. The Alpha, who had once seemed invincible, now appeared as though he was on the brink of collapse. One evening, after another failed assassination attempt on Erevan's life, Kale found the Alpha collapsed in a chair, sweat beading on his forehead. "Erevan," Kale said, rushing to his side. "What's happening to you?" Erevan's eyes flickered weakly up to him. "The curse is consuming me faster than I thought," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Kale's heart clenched. "There has to be another way," he urged. "We can't just accept this." Erevan closed his eyes, shaking his head. "There is no way out. This is my fate." But Kale refused to believe it. The bond between them had given him strength, and he would fight until the end to save Erevan. "I won't let you die," Kale whispered fiercely. "I'll find a way. I swear it." The determination in Kale's voice stirred something in Erevan, a spark of hope he thought he had long since lost. But with the curse worsening and the forces against them growing stronger, time was running out. Chapter 20. The Forbidden Touch. The tension between Kale and Erevan had reached a boiling point. Despite their growing connection, the bond was still fraught with danger. Every touch, every kiss, felt like it could be the last. And yet, neither of them could resist the pull that bound them together. It was as if their souls were tethered by something deeper than the curse itself. One night, unable to hold back any longer, Kale pulled Erevan into his arms. "I can't do this anymore," Kale confessed, his voice raw with emotion. "I can't stand seeing you in pain and not be able to do anything about it." Erevan's eyes flickered with desire, but also with fear. "If anyone finds out, it will kill you," he warned. But Kale didn't care. "I'm already willing to die for you," he said, his lips brushing against Erevan's. The kiss that followed was urgent, desperate, and full of a need neither of them could deny. For a moment, the world around them ceased to exist. When they finally broke apart, their breaths heavy, Erevan's eyes were dark with desire, but also with guilt. "You don't understand, Kale," he whispered, pulling back slightly. "This bond is dangerous. You're risking everything." But Kale, knowing the stakes, didn't back down. "I'm willing to risk everything for you." And in that moment, the course of their fate was sealed. Chapter 21. The Price of Power. The bond between Kale and Erevan had now grown so intense that neither could deny its effects on their bodies and minds. As Erevan's condition worsened, the bond between them seemed to fuel his desperation. Every day, Kale could feel Erevan's pain more sharply, and every night, they grew closer, unable to resist the attraction that seemed to consume them both. Erevan's once proud posture was now slumped, his strength rapidly fading. Despite the bond, Kale couldn't bear to see him so broken. "I won't lose you," Kale whispered one night, holding Erevan tightly as the Alpha trembled. "We'll find a way to break the curse." But Erevan, weak and gasping for air, shook his head. "The price of breaking the curse is too high, Kale. You don't know what you're asking of me." Kale refused to listen. "I'm not asking for you to die. I'm asking you to live. For both of us." The words were spoken with conviction, but Kale could feel the weight of Erevan's resistance. There was a price to pay for the power they sought. Kale could feel it in his bones. But even as they delved deeper into the unknown, the one thing that remained clear was their love for each other. It was undeniable, and no curse, no threat, would ever change that. Chapter 22. The Heartbreaking Choice. As the days stretched on, the consequences of their forbidden love became clearer. Kale could see the toll it was taking on Erevan. The curse wasn't just a physical ailment. It was a slow, insidious unraveling of everything Erevan had once been. His strength was failing, and every day Kale's heart broke a little more seeing him so fragile. The once feared Alpha was now a shadow of himself. "You have to let me go," Erevan said one night, his voice hoarse and filled with sorrow. "You're too young to carry this burden. You deserve someone who can be with you without risk." But Kale refused to listen. "I don't care about what I deserve," he replied firmly. "I care about you. And I'm not going anywhere." The tension between them was palpable, the weight of their situation pressing down on both their shoulders. Erevan's pain was a constant reminder of the stakes. If they didn't break the curse soon, Erevan wouldn't survive. "We don't have much time," Kale whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, Don't push me away. Erevan's gaze softened for a moment, but then his eyes hardened. You don't know the price of love in our world, Kael. It's never free. Someone has to pay for the choices we make. Kael felt the gravity of Erevan's words, but he wasn't willing to give up. If someone has to pay, let it be me, he said, determination burning in his chest. Chapter 23. The First Sign of Hope. A breakthrough came when a strange visitor arrived at the manor. An ancient healer, rumored to have knowledge of curses and magic, appeared at their doorstep. She was a woman who had lived through the ages, her knowledge as vast as the world itself. She claimed to have a way to break Erevan's curse, but it would require an immense sacrifice. I can save him, she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. But it will cost both of you more than you can imagine. Kael and Erevan exchanged a look, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. The healer spoke of a powerful ritual that could sever the curse, but it would require a bond between them stronger than anything they had experienced. The bond must be forged through pain, sacrifice, and love, she explained. Erevan's face darkened at the idea, but Kael felt a flicker of hope. We'll do it, Kael declared. We'll pay whatever price is necessary. Erevan, though reluctant, knew they had no other choice. His life was slipping away, and Kael's determination was the only thing keeping him tethered to hope. The healer gave a small nod, but her expression remained grim. You don't understand yet, she said softly. The bond you're about to forge will change you both forever. There's no turning back once you begin. Despite her warning, Kael's resolve only strengthened. He would do whatever it took to save Erevan, even if it meant losing everything in the process. Chapter 24. The Ritual Begins. The night of the ritual arrived, and the air was thick with tension. The healer led them to a hidden chamber deep within the manor, a room steeped in ancient magic. The walls were lined with symbols that seemed to pulse with energy, and the air hummed with an otherworldly power. Kael and Erevan stood together in the center of the room, their hands clasped tightly. This is it, the healer said, her voice barely a whisper. Once we begin, there's no turning back. Kael nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. Erevan's eyes were filled with fear, but also a deep, unspoken love that made Kael's heart ache. They had already sacrificed so much for each other, but this would be their greatest test. As the healer began the incantation, Kael felt the air around them grow heavy. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the energy in the room surged. Pain shot through Kael's chest, and he gritted his teeth, refusing to let go of Erevan's hand. He could feel the same pain radiating from Erevan, but it wasn't just physical. It was a searing, emotional agony that threatened to tear them apart. This is only the beginning, the healer warned, her voice tinged with sadness. You must endure the pain, or the curse will consume you both. Kael's grip tightened on Erevan's hand. We can do this, he whispered through gritted teeth. We have to. But as the ritual continued, Kael realized just how much they were willing to sacrifice for each other, and how much they stood to lose. Chapter 25. The Final Battle. The ritual reached its peak, and the world around Kael and Erevan seemed to shatter. The air crackled with energy as the curse fought back, thrashing against the bond they were forging. Kael could feel Erevan's agony, his body racked with pain as the curse's power fought to break them apart. It was more than Kael had ever imagined. Every cell in his body screamed with the pressure. But Kael held on. He couldn't lose Erevan. Not after everything they had been through, not after all the sacrifices they had made. Stay with me, Kael whispered, his voice trembling. Please, don't give up. Erevan's eyes, though filled with pain, met his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a flicker of peace in them. With one final push, the curse snapped. Kael and Erevan were thrown back as the energy exploded outward, the magic dissipating into the air. The room fell silent, the tension finally lifting. Kael's heart pounded in his chest, his body bruised and broken from the ritual, but he could feel Erevan beside him, breathing heavily but alive. The curse was broken. But the cost was high, and the journey ahead would be even more uncertain. Kael and Erevan had survived, but they knew that their love, their bond, would never be the same. They had endured the ultimate trial, and now they would face the consequences of their choices. Together.